Welcome, Laura, to the Lisa podcast, where we go inside addiction to raise our audience's level of consciousness. Now, I just wondered if you could start us off by just giving us your definition of addiction and telling us a bit about your journey.
Sure. So this isn't my definition of addiction, but and I don't know exactly where it comes from, but it's the one that makes the most sense to me, which says that addiction is anything that you do despite negative consequences. Continue to do despite negative consequences. That is so, it's simple and true to my experience. My story is I drank somewhat problematically at the beginning, and then very problematically probably for most of the time I was drinking, which is about 15 years. I started when I was a late teenager, and I got sober about the time I was, 37. So almost 20 years, actually. And my primary thing was alcohol. I also did dabble in drugs, but alcohol was the thing that really got me. And I have a pretty typical story in that I grew up around drinking. I surrounded myself with people who drank like I did. I didn't really ever consider that drinking would be a thing like that I would have to quit one day, right? I thought drinking was just part of being an adult, and that it made a better life. It made a more exciting life. It made connections easier. It made me, better, more fun person to be around. All those things, right? And it, over time, as it does, got increasingly more difficult for me to manage. And really, about the time I got married and then had my daughter, who's 11 now, that's when drinking started to really change for me. And I started to just have less control around it. I always say when I had my daughter, I kind of noticed that it stopped working, like I wanted it to work. So I would drink more. And it just, I had to be responsible for more things. I just started to become a little bit more secretive about it. I didn't really want to show how much I was drinking. I always wanted more. And on the outside, though, it looked pretty okay. Unless you were really close to me, it was really hard to tell that something was wrong. And yet over time, I accumulated a lot of consequences. I came close to losing jobs. Actually did lose one job. I had some, horrible blackouts and tons of things that I didn't remember. Physically, I was not doing great. I got a DUI. And then ultimately what got me started on sobriety was that I left my daughter in a hotel room one night, overnight when she was 4 years old at a wedding, because I was blackout drunk. And that really forced me to look at what was going on. So that was in 2013. I finally got sober in 2014. I've been sober now for just over 6 years, and everything in my life has changed. Now I used to work in marketing and advertising, very boozy culture. And over the course of my sobriety, I completely switched careers. I'm now an author and a teacher. And I got divorced. I'm in a new relationship, and I'm summing up a lot of a story into something short, but it was the hardest thing I'd ever gone through, and I thought it was the worst thing that could ever happen, right? For sure, to have to get sober, and it's been the biggest blessing in my life.
Yeah, and like you said at the beginning, it was kind of manageable, and when you first had your daughter, that's when you noticed it stopped working. And what do you feel like that, or how would you describe the experience of it working before and it not working after? What was that difference like?
Yeah, I want to be clear that that's not the only time that I noticed that my relationship with alcohol was not right. kind of aware that I did a little too much, and I couldn't really stop once I started. There was never enough. But when it was working, I would get some relief, right? Like there would be a moment, a period of time where I would feel my nerves sort of settle. My racing thoughts would quiet. I would get that relief. And when I had my daughter, I noticed it just made me more anxious. Like I would get maybe a tiny window of relief, but it was a tiny window. I didn't feel that release. It would sometimes take more for me to feel the effects, or I would not drink as much and I would black out. Like it stopped being as predictable what would happen to me once I started drinking. My hormones were all over the place. There were consequences too for me drinking. I couldn't just drink and say fuck it and not care about what was going on. I had a daughter to take care of. So there was also a level of consciousness or awareness that I had once I had her that I didn't have before, and that gnawed at me, right? So yeah, it's all those things.
Yeah, and like you say, that awareness of your daughter and just being aware of kind of the bigger picture. But like you said, there were still consequences. And what were some of those consequences? You mentioned difficulty in jobs and stuff like that. What did those consequences look like? And I guess how did, those justifications around those consequences, what did they look like and how did that whole process work?
Yeah, so many justifications. There were outer consequences and a lot of inner consequences. So the outer consequences were, I wasn't that great of a friend. I wasn't a great partner. In that I couldn't really keep my word because I couldn't be trusted to show up when I was going to want to show up. I was often too hungover, or I just, would get carried away drinking and not be responsible enough to show up for people. I had, financial messes because my money everything felt out of control, on the outside. My money, well, certainly on the inside, but it manifested on the outside too. My money, my relationships, my work. I wasn't, I was definitely not performing at work the way I should have been, calling in sick a lot. So there were consequences like that. And over time, those build up to a really stressful existence because you're constantly trying to clean up messes. You're constantly trying to cover up the lies that you told to try to save your ass. And so those are some of the outer consequences. And of course, DUI. And then the inner consequences were just this horrific shame that I felt all the time. I was so not in integrity with myself. What I would tell people and the way I felt were very different things. I didn't think that I could be honest about what was going on with me. And so when we aren't integrated, it's really painful. It's a painful existence, right? When our thoughts and our feelings and our actions don't match, it's really hard. We don't want to look at ourselves in the mirror. We become people that we don't know, certainly don't like. And also, a real feeling of helplessness because I didn't really know where to start. And the idea of giving up drinking, when it would cross my mind, was just horrifying. It was just a terrifying idea. I didn't know how to do life without it. So I was in this sort of double bind of being stuck by my own, caught in this addiction and feeling and the alcohol making things worse, but then also feeling like I couldn't really stop.
Yeah, and like you say, being stuck in that sort of shame and guilt and just not really kind of knowing how to get unstuck and how to get out of it. You've obviously got alcohol in your life, which is relieving some distress, but then it's not really working and it's just building up and those sort of negative feelings and consequences just escalating. And what were some of those kind of limiting beliefs that held you back from sort of pushing through to a sober life?
Yeah. Well, I also want to say one of the main inner consequences before I answer your question is I knew I wasn't living up to my potential too. And that's a really painful thing. You know, that isn't just, I say like your unused potential is not benign. It's something that has a really dark force, a dark energy that takes over, you know, and it comes out as depression and bitterness and resentment. But what you asked was, what did you ask? I just lost it.
Yeah, about the limiting beliefs to breaking through.
Limiting beliefs. Yeah. Thank you. Limiting beliefs. Oh man. I'll be boring without alcohol. No one will love me if I am not drinking. Who wants to, I won't be fun. Life won't be exciting. I won't be exciting. Yeah, I mean, those are really big limiting beliefs.
Yeah, and like you say, those big limiting beliefs that sort of block us and keep us kind of stuck. And then also you mentioned that kind of incongruence of not being able to fulfill your potential. And that is like a really dark force. Like you say, we know we can do so much more, but we're just stuck at this kind of glass ceiling and we're not able to sort of break through. And then we've got these limiting beliefs that are sort of holding us back. And when you have a look back at, kind of being in that cycle and that kind of addiction of going round and round, is there any other parts of it that really come to mind?
Oh. I think it's that I think there's so many things, but I think where I really just got stuck and went around and around is that I really just didn't know how to feel anything, feel my feelings. I didn't know how to face the past and the sort of wreckage I've created. And I just didn't think that I could cope. I didn't think life would be really worth living if I couldn't drink. That was the story that I kept rubbing up against. That it's just not going to be worth living. I'll hate life if I'm sober.
Yeah. And like you say, that kind of wake of destruction that we cause as we, go through that cycle of all of the things that kind of go wrong, and like you say, the broken promises, the missed things that we don't turn up, all the days we called in sick at work, all of those things kind of build up. And then we go so far down the rabbit hole, it's like, how do I deal with all of this stuff and take responsibility for it all? And then also, like you say, who will I be on the other side? How will I even deal with all of this stuff without drinking my life? And it's very hard to make sense of that and understand kind of how that process works. It's very kind of not tangible. It's very hard to kind of quantify in a sense. It's not necessarily like an easy sort of physical thing. It's quite metaphysical in a sense. When you think about your life and sort of breaking through that glass ceiling, what were some of the shifts that happened for you?
Yeah, you really can't imagine it because you've never lived it. So it requires an extraordinary amount of faith. Some of the breakthroughs, I had a friendship that turned into a relationship early on. And because one of my really significant beliefs was that no one would love me. I was divorced at the time and I thought, how am I going to date anyone? How am I going to ever be in a relationship? Who will want me? And this man really loved the sober version of me, and he really championed that, and he believed in that, and he wanted that. And that was a really foundational, important relationship to experience because I hadn't had that before. And it's not, it's not that people didn't love the sober version of me, but certainly certain people did. But I hadn't been that person yet. So to be that sort of messy, early sober version of myself and have someone really like see what I couldn't see in myself yet was really tremendous. And then, one of the things is like, because I tried for over a year, like start and stop, I would put together a little period of time and then I would drink again, but over the course of that year and a half, I spent a lot more time sober than I did not. And I started to realize like how much brain capacity I had for work when I wasn't drinking. It was like astounding. I got promoted. I could function. I was so effective. I was more present with people. That was one of those immediate returns that just came back so fast as I was killing it at work. That was something. And then the biggest thing I would say for me was I had always had this desire, this dream, or this I call it like big energy inside of me that I wanted to write, and I wanted to do I didn't want to do the career I was doing. I didn't know what it was exactly, but I knew I had potential for something big inside me. And I always wanted to write. I knew that for sure. And once I started to go through this, even before I was sober, I started writing about it and started putting that writing out there, publishing that writing. And it felt I was really tapping into that potential inside of me that I couldn't access when I was drinking. And I knew that was the case. I knew as long as that was in my life, I started to taste what that felt like to really be in my element and to like pursue this thing that was so intrinsic to who I am and to create, right? There was no room for creation when I was drinking. It was just destruction. I started to see what that was like. And that was a huge breakthrough. Like I wanted that. And I knew that wouldn't happen so long as I kept drinking.
Yeah. And I think one thing you mentioned is you felt more creative and your creativity came out when you stopped drinking. And I think a lot of people that I speak to often say, oh, I need to drink or use drugs to be creative. And I think oftentimes in my experience, it's been the other way around. It's actually like dulled my ability to do things and my potential. It's just kind of like a myth or a mirage that we think it kind of helps with that creativity.
Yeah, I think there is some truth to at least, people have been doing psychedelics and such for a really long time because they can help you sort of bypass the inhibitions and barriers that you have to the consciousness that sort of gets in the way, the self-consciousness rather, that gets in the way of accessing certain parts of your psyche. But it's really it's not sustainable and it's really short-lived. I think people think they are better writers when they're drinking because it lowers your inhibitions. You don't think so much. Your brain's not doing that monkey mind thing so much, so you can drop into these, more romantic feelings, and your dopamine goes up and all that, and it lasts for about 20 minutes, right? And then you deteriorate. So it is ultimately a myth, but I also get where it comes from.
Yeah. Yeah, no, exactly.
There's a reason that we start drinking. There's a reason that people start doing drugs because it does provide relief. It does change our state, and that's what we're looking for. But it never carries us to where we think it's going to carry us.
Yeah, and like you say, it never carries us to where we think we need to be, and that is a better solution that both of us have kind of discovered, which we'll get onto a bit later. But in terms of that kind of stumbling along the path, you mentioned a year when you were kind of trying to get sober, and you were having a glimpse into that future possibility, that future self that fulfilled your potential, that did well at work, that turned up on time, that had focus, that could have a relationship being sober and felt loved being sober. And how did that kind of, sort of stumbling along the path work for you? And how did it kind of gradually happen as opposed to just kind of one day everything's fixed?
Right. Well, after that incident with my daughter, I walked into an AA meeting. I didn't know really what else to do. I just knew that sober people went to AA, or people who wanted to get sober went to AA, and I knew 2 people in the world that were actually sober, and that's what they both told me to do. And I was really, I'm really grateful for that. I started going to those meetings. I mostly hated it, but sometimes I liked it. And then I grew to understand, to know a few people, and I really appreciated it. And so I did that. I went to AA meetings for a good, and I still have a sponsor. I don't go to meetings really anymore, but I went, that was my start. It was the first time I'd heard people talk about the things that I was feeling. And the first time I was able to share, what had been inside of me for so long. So that was really meaningful. And I also didn't quite feel like that was my home, like I was seeking some other avenues too, I guess. One of those was like this creativity piece. I started writing more, and it became clearer and clearer over time that, like I said, the writing and the drinking could not coexist. If I really wanted to pursue this dream, the drinking had to go. I would never get there. So that was a motivating factor over time. And then there's a learning factor too, right? Like, I mean, one piece is the physical addiction. Like that first time I quit, I was still really physically addicted, and that was horrible, So there's a physical addiction that I had to really get through, and lumped into the physical addiction, I would say, is like our neurological sort of addiction of all the pathways that we have laid down, the tracks that we've laid down that. Our conditioning, in any stressful time, even fun time, all the activities that we associate with drinking, I would say that's still a physical response, right? I mean, it's partly psychological, but partly physical, depends on how you look at it, I suppose. But that is a real thing that needs to be changed. It needed to be rewritten. Every time 5 o'clock came around during the day, my brain would go, okay, it's time. Every time that I would come home after work, okay, it's time. Every time I'd go out to dinner, okay, it's time. Those things were all so programmed in my brain over the course of 20 years to be associated with drinking that had to be rewritten. And that certainly doesn't happen all at once. It's really extraordinarily uncomfortable, to go against that instinct, because it's like you don't even think about it as someone who participates in drinking for that long. So there's that. And then there's the truly just like psychological, the limiting belief stuff that I had to work through with the relationship stuff, with all the sort of emotional ties that I had to this idea of being able to drink, right? Being a person who is able to drink. And all these things, changed over time. It would have been awesome if it would have been a once and done, sort of magical experience. And there are people that happens to, but I really value that year and a half. It was horrifically painful. I call it purgatory, because I had one foot in, one foot out. I knew I couldn't keep going. I didn't want to be sober. It was hell. But it was really valuable because that really shaped me, and really, I wouldn't really know in my heart of hearts that I can't drink in safety. I wouldn't be able to empathize with people who struggle, after that first attempt. I wouldn't be able to do the work I do. I wouldn't have been forced to sort of reckon with the deepest parts of myself, So there isn't just one thing. There wasn't just one tipping point, right? It was like many, 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 many things contributed to it. It was reading about it. It was talking to people. It was experiencing the hell of drinking again, despite not wanting to. It was the millionth hangover that I had. It was the crushing anxiety. It was all of those things contributed to it. And then ultimately, there was a moment when I realized, like, okay, you're not physically addicted anymore. You're actually choosing now. It's a small moment, but you're choosing. You're saying, like, screw it. Right now, I'm choosing to drink. And it was sort of being really honest about every aspect of my life. I was still keeping a little group of people that didn't know what I was doing. I was still putting myself in situations where I might drink, and it was really getting clear about, if I'm going to do this, I have to stop lying to myself, basically, about what is going to put me in those situations.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important distinction. Like you say, there's oftentimes, and for me too, a point where something kind of not so good happens, like with your daughter, you're like, right, I need to change. But it doesn't mean that you then change overnight or it then becomes any easier. Like you say, you still have those neural pathways and that physical dependence and all that stuff going on. So although you've had that shift and you then want to change, you still have to kind of do the work, and it's completely okay to, sort of stumble along that journey and keep going over and over and learning and picking up all those different pieces as you go. But one thing you mentioned earlier as well is faith, and I just wondered how you would kind of define the faith and how, that kind of faith in the future of who you could be helped overcome those limited beliefs and helped you get on that other side, in a sense.
Yeah, faith, it was, a belief that there was a future that was possible for me that I couldn't see yet. And sometimes that vision was held up by other women who were sober that could see, that had been there and could see in me what I couldn't see yet. And there was also an element of faith or belief that I wasn't this horrible story that I'd been telling myself, because anyone who's gone through this knows that a very real aspect, a real fear of getting sober is that you're going to have to face everything that you're hiding from. It's not just the pain that maybe caused you to check out in the first place or caused you to numb, but all the accumulated distraction over time. And that's a really daunting task, right? So there is an element of faith required to believe that, one, you can and you will be able to do that, and that, two, you aren't just a summary of all those mistakes and moments of destruction. There's a beautiful, divine, indestructible part of you that exists, and that's true too.
Yeah, and like you say, understanding that's true too, and having those role models and people who are ahead of you on the journey who you can look up to, and also being able to believe in yourself. Like you say, there's a version of me in the future that understands it, and even if I don't even know how I'm going to understand it in the future, I believe that it's possible. I believe that I can get there, and that I can become that person, even if it doesn't make sense right now. And I guess that's exactly what faith is, that belief in something we can't see.
Yes, that's right. I'm just writing a note so I don't want to forget something. Thanks.
Awesome. And in terms of, as you started to enter recovery, you mentioned AA and writing. I just wondered if there was anything else that comes to mind that kind of helped, or anything else you used along your journey.
Oh gosh, so many things. Therapy throughout. I did a lot of, and I still do a lot of work incorporating, like, the body. I'm a yoga teacher, but I also, I'm a student of yoga, and a lot of healing done through the body, somatic experiencing and things like that. A lot of learning, frankly, educating myself on addiction, learning about other people's stories, just reading a ton on psychology and spirituality and the human condition, which I'd always done and I always will do, but I did it with like a new sort of, I had a new, what would you call it? Urgency about it. And then putting myself in community with other sober people, whether it was AA or otherwise, is a huge part of that. Like, we don't do this alone. I had tried to make my friends and my family understand what I was going through, and that just didn't work, and it wasn't helpful for them or for me. We really do need other sober people or other people who have experienced what we're experiencing. And then, a lot of practice, a lot of just patience and practice with learning new tools for coping with learning how to feel my feelings and having help with that. A lot of patience. We want to be better fast. We want everything to be better immediately. And so much of it takes time and a lot of practice and just learning a new way to live. So there's so many pieces that I drew from, but I would say, educating myself was a big one, a program of some kind. I think whether it's AA, another program, or working with a therapist, like really committing to it and sticking to that. And then, and then the patience and practice.
Yes. Yeah, and patience and practice is important, but, I found that being quite impulsive and wanting that instant gratification, that was certainly hard. But like you're saying, one thing we can take away from it is if we're being patient and we're practicing something, then it's generally a skill and it can be learned and it can be developed over time. We develop that sense of patience, we develop those skills around our mental health and building a solid mental foundation, whether that's with, AA, NA, some kind of program, therapy, learning, and having all of the information to upgrade our thinking, all of those different things, yoga and the body and thinking about how we feel and what's happening somatically, all of those different things kind of create that holistic approach, and it doesn't necessarily happen overnight, like you say, but I guess one good thing that I found about recovery is that just as our addiction compounds towards the negative, in recovery, all of these positive things we do compound towards the positive. The more books I read, the more therapy sessions I have, the more meetings I go to, it all builds on top of each other, and it slowly starts to get easier and easier and easier, and start to wade through all of that kind of mental fog and build that solid mental foundation.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. And when you think about where you are now and what it's like in the here and now being sober, what's your life like now, kind of as you've moved forward?
My life is, honestly, I feel so lucky and fortunate. I have done a lot of work and I'll always continue to, but my relationships are infinitely better. I still have some of the same friendships, and a lot of ones sort of fell by the wayside. The relationships that I do have are better, more honest, more meaningful. My relationship with my daughter is wonderful. She's 11 now. She was 5 when I got sober. So she's been, and she has a mom that she can trust, and she knows she's safe with me. It's a really big deal. My work is entirely different. I can't even imagine. I could not have imagined that I would be this fulfilled in work. I was always a person that liked to work, and I was pretty good at it in advertising and marketing, but I wouldn't say I was fulfilled necessarily, and I didn't know that was possible like it is today. And then I have a great relationship, after a really long time of being single or dating for, 8 years. I have a relationship that's really wonderful. And, all those things, like, I don't want to make it sound like everything is perfect, because it's certainly not. But there's an inner peace and a trust with myself, and a peace and a freedom that I have constantly, that doesn't waver, no matter what the circumstances are in my life. And that's what's really valuable. I have a relationship with myself, with God, that I can stand on.
Yeah. And I think that's the difference. When we're kind of drinking or using drugs, we have drink or drugs to kind of turn to that we believe solves all our problems, and it just ends up generally making things worse. But when we have kind of built that mental foundation, we have that kind of inner peace and calmness and resilience and the mental and cognitive ability and tools to deal with stuff that's going on in life. And in both examples, and both sides of the coin, there's still all this stuff going on in life. Life happens, there's ups and downs and everything in between, but it's just that shift in not changing necessarily the contents of what's happening, but changing the context and the lens that we see the world through.
Right.
And you spoke about changing your career. What was that like, shifting your career, and what's your career look like now?
Oh, that was such a wild, fun, crazy, transition. I started doing what I do now, or I started doing other things, meaning writing. I started a podcast in 2015 called Home, which has ended in 2016, but it was an incredible experience. I started, creating, which is what I wanted to do. And creating things that were in the area that I really care about, which is psychology and addiction and personal development and stuff like that. I started doing that I did it for almost 2 years before I finally left my job, so it wasn't, it was a slow process. And what I do now is I am an author. My first book just came out in January. It's a memoir called We Are the Luckiest. And, I have an agent and I'm writing another book. It's like a whole world that I didn't, that had nothing to do with the Laura's world of 2015 or whatever, 14. And I also run a company. I have a sobriety support community that I run called the Luckiest Club, that we have, meetings and support community and classes. I also am the creator of several online classes. So I work for myself. I have a small team, and I work wherever I want, which is one of the sort of, when I imagined what I wanted my life to be like, I didn't know exactly what I would be doing specifically, but I knew that I wanted to be able to work from anywhere, and I wanted space in my days, and that I had a lot of room to create. And I'm mentioning that because I think a lot of times people are very interested in changing careers. So they think they're in the wrong job, but they don't know what else they would do. And I always tell them to focus on how you want to feel. Focus on how you want your days to feel, right? And that's a really good starting point, because we don't know how. I could have never scripted what exactly I'm doing now. I just followed sort of the breadcrumbs. I followed the next breadcrumb and the next breadcrumb and the next breadcrumb, and it leads to a place where, where I am now. But none of us, I think this idea that you can have a plan, a real specific plan, is pretty much a lie. I don't think that it ever really works like that. I think you can have a plan and you follow that plan, but then you gain new information and that changes. So I think that's a much more doable approach for people. So that's what it looks like today. I run those things and I'm writing another book.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. And like you say, it's good for the audience and people to focus on, how do they want to feel, what kind of personality attributes do they want, rather than thinking, you know, oh, I want this job or that job or this amount of money in the bank account or to live in this house. Don't think about the kind of materialistic things. Think, who do you want to be? How do you want to feel? Like you say, that sense of freedom to be able to work when you want, wherever you want in the world is amazing. That ability to be able to, you know, spend time with your daughter and just to do your own thing. Those feelings of freedom are more important than the specific job or the specific amount of money in the bank account, for example. So I think
you just can't start from that standpoint. I mean, I love money, and money is important too. It's not that you can't want that, but yeah, I didn't make, in that first few years, I didn't make anywhere what I, you know, was making in my career as in marketing and advertising. So to say it needs to be this, or I'm not going to make the jump, that's usually a non-starter. Yeah.
Yeah. And like you say, it can still be on the priority list, just not, you know, kind of at the top few things, and focus on the personality first.
Right.
Yeah, awesome. And you mentioned your book that's just came out in January. I just wondered if you could tell us a bit about that and, yeah, some of the things that are in it.
Yeah, so the book is, it's a memoir of my experience with addiction, but mostly with what getting sober was like. I really wanted to talk to write about that versus the addiction story, which are almost the same, you know. And I think the getting sober part is the really fascinating part. Like, what was that actually like? I talk a lot about, you know, what I went through in those first purgatory year and a half, and that for those first couple of years, you know, the shame of being a mother who drank, how I overcame that, how I overcame or sort of worked through the getting honest, how, you know, learning to tell the truth is a big theme, how I worked with this idea that no one would love me, and sort of my relationships with men, which were really painful and a big part of, really tied into drinking. And then there's also some practical stuff in there. You know, it's not just narrative memoir. There's some practical stuff for people that are early in sobriety.
Yeah, and like you say, those practical things, as well as being able to, for people to see and have a frame of reference of how to manage the shame of, you know, being a mother who drinks, how to work through those things. And like you say, there's a lot of stories almost out there about what it's like to be in addiction, but it's good to focus on what it was like to get sober, to go through that process, and yeah, to paint that picture, which is really good.
Yeah, thank you.
And then you also mentioned the Lucky Club. I wondered if you could tell us a bit about the Lucky Club and where people can find that and how they can join, and yeah, what it's like to be in the Lucky Club.
Sure. It's called the Luckiest Club. And I actually started in the pandemic. I started hosting free sobriety meetings, support meetings for people who couldn't go to meetings anymore. And then it turned into, I saw really clearly that there was a big need there, and I was going to just stop it because it was a lot of work to do, and I wasn't, you know, I didn't have a team or anything, and I realized, like, oh, this could be really wonderful for people, and it was honestly helping me so much. So we have 17 meetings a week at various times, at least 2 meetings each day, led by my team. There's sobriety support meetings so people can come and hear others talk about, you know, their experiences, but also share. There's a forum, a member forum, where they can connect and have community. And then there's a part of the program called the Academy, where we have master classes on things like sleep and love addiction and the Enneagram and things like that, but also a group coaching call with me once a month. And it's evolving. You know, this is still pretty new. We were thousands strong at this point, which is awesome, but we're just continuing to develop cool things and ways to support. The best part about it is we support all paths to recovery, so it's not AA specific, it's not any program specific. All people are welcome.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, so it sounds like you're doing some amazing things, and where's the best place for people to find out more about you or get your book or join the Luckiest Club? Where's the best place for them to go?
My book is anywhere books are sold. So it's on Amazon, and in the U.S. I think you can also buy it. I think you can buy it in the U.K. on Amazon, but it's definitely on Audible, and it's on Kindle too. And then the second question. Oh, they can find me. My website is my name, lauramckowen.com, and I'm on Instagram. That's sort of my favorite social media platform. Yeah, and all the information about the Luckiest Club is on my website.
Awesome. Yeah, I'll link it all down below, all the links to all your amazing stuff. And was there anything you wanted to kind of leave our audience with, or anything else on your mind?
No, this is great. Thank you.
Okay, awesome. Well, yeah, thanks very much for coming on the podcast. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thanks, you too.